I don't know. We are living in very strange times, aren't we? In which questions that would have seemed absurd to ask just a short while ago are now considered too difficult to answer without some kind of specialized degree or education, like a biology degree. Like the question, what is a woman? We can say endless things about women's rights, but without ever actually defining our terms as we do so. And yet this is incredibly intuitive. For example, there's a website that I'm in the habit of visiting from time to time, which uses one of those CAPTCHA security checks to make sure that you're not a robot. And one of the questions it asks includes a grid of low resolution portraits, and it says, click on all the women. And somehow, I've never gotten that answer wrong. The Google one with all the crosswalks or the boats or the trains or whatever, I've been denied access several times because of that. But the men's and women's faces, I've nailed it every single time. Now, how is that possible when I'm not able to ask them what their pronouns are? How is it possible that when you ask apparently smart and educated academics, what is a woman, they resort to textbook circular explanations before just falling apart emotionally?
You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview.
I would say that it is, at least in part, and whether they know it or not, because they are significantly conditioned by a philosophical school of thought called nominalism. Today, nominalism is the prevailing philosophy in whatever is left of the Western tradition. According to a few statistics that I read, most philosophers surveyed described themselves as nominalists. Nominalism holds that universals like woman, they don't actually exist. Like the particular person, Sharon, who lives down the street from me, if I ever describe her as a woman, woman is just a naming convention that I use. It doesn't actually correlate to anything in reality. Like banana doesn't exist. Banana is just a name we give to particular yellow things that are kind of tricky to open, but oh so rewarding if you can actually figure out how to do it. Nominalism denies that the essence of a particular thing exists and says that when you say dog or tree or banana, you aren't really saying anything about objective reality or even the thing. You're actually saying something about yourself, just your own mind's way of organizing things into categories and then articulating them as names. But come on. Does anyone actually believe that? I don't believe for a second that anyone who describes themselves as a nominalist actually lives their life as if that's true, because it refutes itself in practice, if not also in principle. It refutes the utility of using names to describe things. We wouldn't actually be able to come up with and consistently use names for things if they didn't correlate to the universals that we've given a name to. Like imagine a friend of yours travels to a foreign land and they're telling you all about their travels, and then they start to explain that over there, they actually have cats too, but they aren't like our cats. They have scales instead of fur, and they only have one eye, they have a beak, and as far as I could tell, they seem to live exclusively underwater. Wouldn't you be sort of justified if you replied, then why do you call that a cat? But if nominalism were true, there would be nothing amiss about someone doing that. And that's what most everyday conversations would be like, where the names we use for things are entirely at the mercy of our own usage and are untethered from the objects of the external world. So you might be thinking, well, why does anybody believe this? The reason that nominalism is so attractive for so many people, especially philosophically literate people, is because it rejects the need for metaphysics. It's an escape from the oldest riddles that thinking people have been wrestling with for as long as we've been thinking. For example, how can a thing change and still be itself? That seems kind of absurd because we just know that it's still itself, but how do you actually rationally make sense of that? That was the problem for people who wanted to think rationally. Like me, for example. I've changed dramatically over the span of my life. Like, I resent embarrassing stories that my parents tell about me from like when I was 9 years old. And then at the end, they always punctuate it with this most annoying question. They say, do you remember when you did that? And I'm thinking to myself, like, strictly physiologically speaking, you're not even talking to the same human anymore. Why should I be embarrassed by these things I supposedly did when I was 9 years old? Virtually everything about me has changed. I weigh 3 times as much as I did then. I speak and act in a way that is unrecognizable to that little boy. Virtually My entire cellular composition has been entirely replaced more than once, and my beard is at least a little bit thicker. If you only knew me when I was 9 years old and you were reintroduced to me now, you might as well be introduced to a new person. And yet, you will never convince my parents that the person they knew when I was 9 is not actually the same person sitting in front of them right now. How do we rationally make sense of that? How can something change so dramatically in almost every empirical way and still be itself? The ancient philosopher Heraclitus put it this way: a man never steps in the same river twice. What he means by this is that the last time you stepped in a river, it was an entirely different array of matter, different molecules of water, different fish, different debris floating by, etc. And yet we don't have cartographers standing on every riverbank ready to rename the river and update all of our maps every 20 seconds because the old name doesn't apply to it anymore. But if nominalism were true, that would be legitimate and maybe even necessary. If nominalism were true, every time someone wanted to tell a story about crossing the Mississippi, the person on the other end receiving that information would have to be like, "What's the Mississippi again?" And the other person would have to explain in detail everything that is particular to the exact river that they crossed, because Mississippi is only a name used to describe the particular river at that particular moment in time. How a thing can change and still be itself, or how a thing can be one and many at the same time, like there can be many dogs and one instance of dog, is a riddle that was solved by metaphysics. Metaphysics is the thought that introduces the concept of being, that all dogs have a particular kind of being and nature that is shared among them, which is why when we apply a name to that being or that universal, it makes sense to other human beings to whom it is communicated. In order to define a thing in spite of all the changes it might experience, you have to look at variables other than just its material composition. You have to look at something like its end. What does it do? What is its purpose? You have to look at something like its form. How is the matter that it's composed of arranged in a certain way to be what it is? A table is made of wood, and a chair could be made of the exact same wood, but the form and the purpose distinguish them for us. So what is it that's common to every particular human being so that the word human makes sense to us and can be applied to all of those particular instances? What is its nature or its essence? Because its nature doesn't exist in space and time, I can't point to the universal human and say, there it is. I can only point to a particular human who possesses that nature. And as soon as you admit that, things start to get a little bit spooky, right? This is all starting to sound a little bit paranormal, don't you think? If universals exist, these spaceless, timeless fixtures of reality, and they permeate all of your knowledge, then that suggests that you yourself, or at least the rational part of you, is also spaceless and timeless because it knows about these things and it even kind of interacts with them in a certain way, and it does so intuitively. And atheists, empiricists, and skeptics don't like admitting this. So nominalism suddenly appears like a clever rescue line to get out of all of this paranormal metaphysics. But again, here's the fatal flaw in nominalism. Nobody lives as if it's true. Like, imagine a committed nominalist who really lives his life as if this were true. And on his way home from work, he gets a text from his wife that says, "We've been invited over for dinner to the neighbor's house and they asked us to bring over a fruit tray. So I need you to stop at the grocery store and pick up this list of fruit." And the list includes things like raspberries and strawberries, blueberries, apples, pears, oranges, and grapefruits. And he says, "Yeah, no problem. I've done this 100 times before. I know how to connect those names to the particular things themselves, even though the names don't describe particular things, they describe universals." Because his wife didn't ask him, "Go pick up a specific orange-colored fruit with skin on the outside and a nice citrusy flavor." She asked him to get an orange. It can be any decent orange. So he does as he's told and he goes to the store, but just before he arrives, something horrible has happened. An act of treachery and terrorism has been committed that in a nominalist world would be impossible to recover from. A disgruntled stock boy who hates his employer has decided to quit, but in the ultimate act of sabotage just before he left, he rearranged all the labels on all the produce so that the names don't correctly correlate to the displays anymore. And in a nominalist world, there would be no remedy to this situation. Nobody would be able to tell what was what anymore until we got our best academics and experts in to decide how the labels could be set right. So now the dinner party is ruined because our nominalist friend doesn't know how to identify particulars with its universal name. Unless he actually can, and let's admit it, he actually can identify an orange without the label. He's only a nominalist because he doesn't want to admit the obvious fact that universals are an obvious part of reality, and metaphysics is the best way to account for that rationally. Here's the last thing I'll leave you with. Our very first rational instincts, from the moment we're able to construct sentences and ask questions, we start asking a particular question, which is, what is that? As a parent, I know this. My kids have been asking that question over and over again from a very, very young age. And this is a question about universals. They're instinctively and automatically, without any formation or instruction, assuming the validity of universals by asking that question. The first time they see a pineapple, they are confounded. They've seen apples, but they've never seen pokey apples before. The question escapes their lips, what is that? That isn't a question about names. They're not asking me to give them a grammar lesson. They're asking me to tell them about the thing they've just seen for the first time and how it fits into the nature of being. The word is in that question is a question about being. The word that in the question is a question about the particular thing. They've seen the particular thing and it's intelligible to them and they've made sense of it, but now they want to know, what is its nature? What is its being? What is this particular thing? This is an ontological and a metaphysical question, and it's a fundamental characteristic of our rational souls. The difference between a nominalist and a realist is that when a kid asks that question, a committed and consistent nominalist would either have to say, that's an invalid question, and consistently crush his child's soul, or he'd have to say, oh, you're asking a question about me and what my mind calls that particular thing. The realist says, no, my child is asking me a question about the world, and I'm going to help him understand it. Because it's good to want to know about something other than ourselves rather than making everything about ourselves. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you made it this far, it's either because you fell asleep or because you really like me. And if it's the latter, I feel okay asking if you would consider helping me out by subscribing, liking, sharing, and if you really like me, consider supporting my channel by joining the reinforcements, where you can get opportunities to interact with me and others personally. You can sign up at brianholdsworth.ca. And if you're looking to buy or move, consider using Real Estate for Life. They are a network of real estate agents that will share your pro-life and pro-family beliefs, which are pretty important when it comes to making a big decision like finding a house. You can find them at realestateforlife.com.